Welcome to the Following Films podcast, where we explore the creative minds behind the movies and shows you love. I'm your host, Chris Maynard. Today we're diving into the sonic world of Invincible, Amazon's hit adult animated superhero series that's equal parts heartfelt and harrowing. If you've been following the journey of 17-year-old Mark Grayson as he discovers his powers and unravels the dark truth about his father, Omni-Man, then you already know this show pulls no punches, visually or sonically. Joining me today is Brad Meyer, a Golden Reel winning and Emmy-nominated supervising sound editor whose work has helped define the visceral and emotional landscape of Invincible. Brad brings over a decade of experience in post-production audio and has lent his talents to projects across Netflix, HBO, Hulu, Nickelodeon, and more. From creepy horror films to energetic animated adventures, Brad's sound design isn't just about effects, it's about storytelling. In this episode, we'll talk about how sound shapes the world of Invincible, what it takes to balance superhero spectacle with grounded emotional beats, and why audio is one of the most powerful and often overlooked tools in filmmaking. So turn it up, settle in. This is Following Films.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Good, man. How are you today?
Good. Pleasure meeting you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited.
Yeah, well, there's not very often that I get to talk to somebody who's directly working on something that makes me cool in the eyes of my 14-year-old. So thank you for that, for lending a little bit of credibility to an old man. I do appreciate that, man.
Hey, my pleasure. The real question is, why are you letting your 14-year-old watch Invincible?
Because I am a terrible American. And as a typical American father, this has been going on for generations where all the violence in the world, there's no problem. But if you show half a boob, I can't handle it with my kids around. So
That
it's
I get.
so
Yep.
Invincible, the way it handles its sexuality, everything goes off screen. So it's fine. Doesn't it? It all works out.
Blood and guts, though. That's
Oh,
fine.
blood and
Yeah.
guts. I mean, and it's to a point that's absolutely wonderfully absurd at times, but yeah, so it just works. It doesn't bother us. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad I can give you some street cred out there.
Thanks, man. So okay, can we talk a little bit about, because this is one of those things that I really am just floored by the sound design in this thing. And I think it's something that could go unnoticed because of how for a show like this, it's so subtle sometimes because you have these huge, like think of this last season, the finale, where that's such a long stretch of this is this huge fight sequence. But then you also have these quiet, small moments that happen there that are just as important, where the sound drops out and you just have these really quiet character moments. And
Yeah.
there's not that need to continue that throughout, and it feels like it's always character driven to me, which is something surprising for a show like this. Could you just talk a little bit about approaching supporting a narrative through sound?
Yeah. Well, I would say, something Invincible as a whole does really well
Yeah.
is the balance between just like over the top, ridiculous, huge fight oriented scenes and, intimate discussions between characters on the roof of Mark's house, for example. You know, I would say the finale episode of season 3 is not the best example because it's like 40 straight minutes of people beating the crap out of
But
each other.
it does stop at times though. It really does.
does.
It completely, even in the middle of the fight, it'll drop out and stop at times with
Yeah.
that and get quiet.
And so, I have to shout out our partners on the music team, John Paisano, Scott Shirley, Crystal Mangano. They're great, and they really kind of carve out moments for us, which is nice. And so, a lot of those moments, sometimes it's just music dropping out, and then sound effects gets to do the heavy lifting. Which is kind of a cool feature for us because it's not very often that sound effects go unaccompanied. But in those moments when we do get a little more intimate with characters, we do go out of our way to play off of some of the finer details. Everything from Foley and props and cloth movement to,
Mm.
let's say the scene that we're in a city was just destroyed, the gravel that someone's body is sliding on. We're going to cover all those little fine details. And we also go out of our way to play up the ambiences and environments as well. They live in like a fictionalized version of the city of Chicago in the show.
Hmm.
So we and I'm born and raised in Chicago, so that was a lot of fun for me working on the show. I have like these old custom recordings of the elevated trains,
Oh,
and
cool.
I do try to use as much of those real life sounds as I can to kind of give the space personality too. Um, but yeah, so we do a lot of that kind of stuff. In a big scene, we're definitely utilizing like the surround sound space a little more than, let's say, like a conversational scene between characters. Um, and then a lot of times we're really pumping the subwoofer, the LFE channel,
Hmm.
in moments like that. Um, so many of these characters are supposed to be like otherworldly strong.
Yeah.
So we're gonna feel some extra beef on some of those fight scene moments, or even if you have a particularly intimidating character who's large in size, like Battle Beast, for example. Sometimes we'll even add sort of subwoofer sweeteners on something as simple as their footsteps to give them some extra weight. Um, and then another thing I think that kind of helps the contrast between, a giant scene and maybe a more intimate scene is how realistic or unrealistic that things can get. We try to play the smaller, more intimate moments on a more realistic level.
Mm.
But when you have like two superheroes from another planet, going at it, it's like you're sprinkling in stuff in a scene like that isn't necessarily um, you're not playing that for realism.
No.
Even if it's the sound of the impacts. Sometimes you have like magic that comes into play, like the fifth episode of this newest season, season three. There's this huge like mythical dragon that
Yeah.
Mark is fighting, and so there's kind of like ancient magic that goes along with like the sound of something like that. And even you know like when they're in space, for example, in the show,
Hmm.
we roll off like a ton of the high end in the mix and kind of um, give space an entirely different vibe where it's like, is that realistic? No,
No,
you're
but
not.
I mean, it shouldn't be, but
Yeah, you're not going to hear any sound in space. So, I think sort of the balance of what's expected and realistic from an audience versus what's just completely ridiculous, but you still kind of buy it.
mhm.
Um, that's kind of the balancing act that we play for those sorts of things.
Well, I think if the only thought is, if you're watching a show like this, the only thought around sound that you should really have is, oh shit, I need to put on headphones because this is going to wake up the kids right now, is
Yeah,
probably the
yeah.
only thought you should be having when you're watching something like this. So it's never distracting, but it's very thoughtful though. And I can, because going back and rewatching a couple of the episodes preparing for this interview to think about it through that lens of sound, which I often think of things through sound anyway, because I cover a lot of independent films, a lot of independent shows,
Yeah.
first time filmmakers, where the advice I will always give people if they want to hear it is to pay attention to the sound, because we can forgive a lot of things. You can have a look that might feel a little bit choppy or a little bit odd, but
Hmm.
when your sound isn't balanced from scene to scene and it doesn't feel right, it makes it feel so much cheaper and smaller than it probably actually is. And it's
Yeah.
just such an underappreciated art form, I think.
I mean, a huge part of what we do is to go unnoticed,
Yeah.
and even in animation, the amount of people that approach me and don't realize that it just doesn't sound that way. Like there's a team of people that's creating all that stuff from scratch,
Yeah.
um, and even on your favorite live action TV shows or films, that's not just the sound you're getting off of the camera. There's a whole team of people that you know it's so fabricated and fake that you
Of
buy it
course.
as real. And that's kind of the fun of what we do. But also, sound is a fun mix of um, like art and science almost. There's a lot of kind of physics that go into it. Even creatively, you're like, okay, are we going to hear this reverberate off the buildings in the city, or the whole space thing again? It's like, well, what is space? Yeah, we can't really hear sound in space. What should space sound like
But
in
we all
in
have an idea
context
of
like
what it
this?
sounds like in our mind because we've watched enough television and seen enough movies that take place that you have a perception of it.
Exactly, exactly.
You watch, like, one of my favorite films is The Abyss, James Cameron's film, and that
Nice.
is everything in that movie is not that I'm talking about aliens and that, but nobody would have lights pointed at their face if they were underwater. It just doesn't make sense. You just wouldn't see the
Uh-huh.
characters.
Exactly.
You wouldn't hear anything. You wouldn't hear any of that stuff. It would be very quiet and distant. And when you're hearing things like that, it would not work the way that it does underwater, the sound when you're out in that. And so it's, but it feels emotionally honest. And I think that's what you're doing here. You're playing into the character beat, and that's why we go with it. So if you're giving us things that we're able to connect with the characters more or connect with the story more, I think it works and we'll buy in at that point. We won't be but distracted by it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And it helps that this show in particular has a certain self-awareness,
Yeah.
and I would say even sense of humor where, in a scene like in season 2 when Rexplode gets shot in the head, it's just like the amount of blood that pours out of this guy's body. And it's like that alone is not a realistic scenario. So you're almost playing a scene like that for comedy
Hmm.
with like the amount of blood that you're making. And so some of it is kind of tongue in cheek, which is nice, and creates these opportunities for us to like play around with it and have fun.
Well, this show is immediately telegraphing what it is. The way
Hmm.
that they play with the title card in every episode, and that it's always somebody saying "Invincible" and then just going to the title card and it just cutting away
Yeah.
from it, and it just the way that they mess with that. It reminds me of the opening of The Simpsons, where it's just like, how are they going to do it this week? What are they going to do with it? Sometimes it's very
Hmm.
small, other times it's repeating it 30 times, and it's amazing. So it just goes back and forth, and it's the same thing with the. It took me a full season, I think, to get used to the fact that there's going to be the credits and we're going to have an additional 5-10 minutes
Yeah.
of footage after that. So it's like the show is absolutely operating on its own wavelength and telling you exactly what it is. It's just you kind of have to let go of a lot of conventional storytelling to meet the show where it is. And I think that's why it's resonating with people so deeply.
Yeah, and I think that traces back to the source material, the
Yeah,
comics
the
too.
books.
Like, you know, we work with like Robert Kirkman, the creator, on the show
Yep.
too, and a lot of people involved with the comics, and like that's just who they are as people. They're pretty good about you know. I don't want to say not taking it too seriously because they do. They take it very seriously, but again, they have a really good sense of humor about what we're all doing.
Yeah.
And in the end, I think that makes the show a lot more fun to watch as a viewer because um, it reflects in the final product that like the people that are working on it are having a good time.
Well, you can take your work very seriously without taking yourself or the material very seriously, where you're putting it
Exactly.
on a self-important or this is a part of the conversation in the world that we need to add this to the world. No, you can you can take it and be very serious about the look of it, about the feel of it, about what you're trying to convey, but have a lot of fun while you're doing that at the same time. You don't want it to look bad. You don't want the story beats to not make sense. You want it to hit in a certain way, but you know, it's sometimes you have to be very serious about making something that's utterly goofy and silly. And if you put
Yeah.
it under any amount of microscope and try to examine it, it won't hold up. But you don't care because it's that's not the point of what you're watching.
Yeah, I mean, we know the audience is going to suspend their disbelief
I hope so.
when I stuff in the show, so we're just having fun with it.
So then, what is what got you into sound in the first place? Because you're talking about kind of walking around Chicago and picture a guy with the tape recorder going around, getting under the L and doing that and just getting like the ambient noises of that city and trying to put things together. What made you go this direction? Because it's kind of like you said, it's invisible work. So it's
Yeah.
not somebody looking for
Uh,
the spotlight.
yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, doing this professionally, it's interesting to see how everyone kind of comes into this with a different background, and there's no like one path.
Hmm.
Um, I probably started with music, I would say. I was in a band in high school and college, and I knew I didn't want to do music professionally, but I definitely wanted to do something creative. I knew that for
Hmm.
sure. And I was interested in sound ever since the band that I was in. We recorded a couple of albums when we were young, and just watching the engineer, at the mixing board, I thought that was so cool, and that felt like a little more tangible to me
Yeah.
than you know, potentially being a musician. And so I started taking like audio video classes in high school. And that was really my first intro into the fact that this was even a thing that people did. And the AV classes I took in high school were way more geared towards picture-based things, camera, editorial, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And so we didn't cover a lot of sound topics in those high school classes. And I was left wanting to know more. And so I ended up pursuing sound in college. I went to Columbia College in Chicago, and I was a film student at the time. But the way Columbia was structured was within the film program, you could pick a concentration,
Hmm.
and I chose sound for visual media. That's what they called it. So I specifically went to college for like sound design, basically. um, and then my senior year, I was lucky enough to get an internship with the sound crew that did the Matrix films.
Just a
Um,
small little way to get your foot.
well, the Wachowskis who created the Matrix, they
Hmm.
are based in Chicago. They're Chicago natives, and they make most of their stuff in Chicago, or at least
Oh,
they did at the time. So you know, they flew out an entire Warner Brothers crew, not just sound people, but picture editors, visual effects people. All of them worked locally in Chicago on the show that I was working with them on, and the plan is just kind of aligned where I happened to be available when they were looking for someone, and I was a teaching assistant, and my professor recommended me.
oh wow.
And yeah, like the next week, I started interning for them on a Netflix series called Sense8.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so and that was really cool because the sound thing I had a bit of a grasp on, but the watching how the machine worked from the inside, that was really informative for me. And I was on Sense8 for about 6 months, I
Okay.
believe, basically my entire like last semester. Um, and then when that wrapped, I did the classic move out west to LA thing. Um, and my first job I landed actually was at Boombox Post, which is where I still work to this day. I've been at Boombox for a little over 10 years now,
Wow.
and it's been a great ride. We do specifically animation sound.
Hmm.
Um, so, everything from adult-oriented things like Invincible to preschool aged shows. It really runs the gamut, and every week I'm working on something new. It keeps it really, really fresh and exciting.
Are there particular types of projects that you prefer working on? Do you think there's something that your skill set is best suited for?
Well, there's something to be said for working on adult stuff because you can like talk to other adults about it. It's tough when, I'm working on a Mickey Mouse show or something and the core audience is like 3-year-olds. Um, but I will say each kind of age group that you're working for or project or even more specifically each network
Hmm.
has kind of a different vibe to it and a different set of challenges. When you're working on something like Invincible, the main goal is to entertain. But if you're working on things for smaller kids, it's keeping their attention. And if there's a ton going on in a scene for a preschool show, it's focusing their attention. What on screen should they be looking at? If it's a scary episode of like the Muppet Babies, which was another show I worked on. It can't be too scary because you
Oh,
don't want to
wow.
scare the kids. So on a show like Invincible, that's not something I would have to worry about necessarily.
Sure.
So yeah, each project definitely has its own challenges and ways that we can kind of flex our creative muscle. Um, but I'd be lying if I wasn't partial to the Invincibles and the things with a bit of an older audience that I can talk to people like you about.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be going hey, did you see the new episode of Gabby's Dollhouse
But
to another 40-year-old, you know what I mean?
what ends up happening though, in 20 years down the line from now, when you're the grizzled veteran at this, and there's this young filmmaker that's up and coming, and they'll find out that you worked on Muppet Babies and you'll get your Oscar that year because you're going to go out
It's
and they're going to be like, "Oh, you did the thing that changed my life." So
it
working.
is it is funny because kind of reviving properties is like a
Mhm.
big thing right now. So, I'm working on revivals of things that I grew up watching as a kid. We did the Rugrats revival for Nickelodeon. We did the DuckTales revival for Disney a few years back, and it's like I remember watching the originals. So
So do I.
it is kind of a full circle moment on some of these shows, definitely. But even something that's been running for a really long time, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so many iterations of that show and that
Yeah.
property, and just so many generations of kids grew up watching it. Or Transformers. I work on Transformers as well. That's been around for going on 50 years now. So it's like, some of these things are legacy properties that resonate with like almost every age group, which is kind of fun. Um, but yeah, it keeps things fresh and exciting, and I think my favorite thing about working on animation is um, the people. I think there's a general consensus between everyone in the animation world that like, hey, we're making cartoons.
Yeah.
We're not saving lives. We're not doctors. But I think similar to what I was saying about Invincible earlier, it's like when you can tell people are having fun working on something and having a good time with it, I think it just makes the whole thing better. And the final product,
Oh,
I think people can tell.
absolutely. You bring up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I think the original theatrical film just turned 35,
Yeah,
very recently,
crazy.
which is so bizarre because if you think of 1989 and you go back 35 years from that point,
Hmm.
you're in the mid 50s. So you think
I know.
of that difference in time of what you pictured the mid 50s and the late 80s and how different those worlds are. And then the late 80s to now doesn't seem that far apart. And yet yeah, it's just a very, very bizarre thing that it's that old at this point. It explains the gray on me, but that's about it.
And a byproduct of that is, like I said, these different generations of the Ninja Turtles, and
Yeah.
then the people that grew up watching the originals, like their kids are watching the ones we're working on now. So, and kind of a fun byproduct of that is when you're working on these modern versions of those shows that have been around forever.
Hmm.
You want them to be fresh and cool, but you want to pay homage to the ones that came before and stay true to the originals too. So, it creates a lot of cool opportunities for detective work if it's something I'm not familiar with. Like I wasn't a huge Transformers fan before I started
Sure.
working on the show, and it's like, okay, well, I'm gonna go home and like watch the originals, and kind of educate myself. So, it's a fun. The research process is a fun part of working on things like that too.
Did you know prior to your research project that Orson Welles was in a Transformers movie at one point in time?
No, that's crazy. Wow.
Oh yeah, the original Transformers, the movie. Was it Omnicron? I can't remember the name of the big bad in that one, but the villain in it, whatever is that giant
I
planet monster, is Orson
Wow.
Welles
I had no
voiced the.
idea.
Yeah, yeah.
That's super crazy.
That is ridiculous. That's how, because I'm 48, so that was my initial exposure to Orson Welles, who I knew who he was. He was the voice of that. So no Citizen
Wow.
Kane, no Touch of Evil. No, it was Transformers is where it all goes back to for me.
I mean, it's just wild to think Orson Welles was alive at that time, but I guess he wouldn't have been that old. He would have been what, in his 60s?
I mean, he was, yeah, 60, 70, something like that. I mean, it was one of the
That's
last
crazy.
things he did, but because he died kind of young. But, well, and I'll get off this in just a second and kind of wrap things up. But it's when you forget about it, but like that Picasso was alive in the 70s,
Yeah,
something like
definitely.
that. You're like, that doesn't, in my mind, it feels like he was somebody from 100 years before then. Like those works, the fact that there's a guy who knew what late night television was, that he watched Johnny Carson. That just doesn't seem like that it could have existed in the same world. So yeah, I can't get my head around aging with that stuff sometimes. But yeah, I just really do. One episode I wanted to call out real quick with the sound stuff in Invincible, just kind of bring things back.
Sure.
There's an episode that starts with a couple, and it just goes through their whole arc in the opening of this episode this last season, where you see kind of what led to their eventual downfall and what caused
Yeah.
them to choose this life and how Invincible impacted them. And it's borderline tear jerking in the opening of that. And that's so absurd that you can pull off those levels of emotions in the same show, because things that happen later in that episode are as big and bombastic as anything else that happens in the
Mhm.
show. But you start out with something that's so small and so human, and it's one of just the gut punch of it. I adore the show for doing that.
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm assuming you're talking about the one where it's all music
Yeah,
at the beginning. Yeah.
yeah.
And that was
Because there's no
interesting.
no dialogue. It's all
There
through
isn't.
them.
It's yeah, music the entire time. And that was interesting working on that because we did a full sound pass on
Okay,
that opening scene, and it wasn't really decided upon until a bit later in the process that we were going to play it really music forward. Um, and when you don't have sound effects to ground the audience in that world, it's strange if you have dialogue.
hmm.
So, and vice versa, if you're playing sound effects with no dialogue, also it feels like something's wrong,
Oh, interesting.
or like it was an accident.
Yeah,
So they decided to go music heavy on that entire opening. And it almost plays like a big montage sequence, which it sort of is.
sure.
It's a telling of kind of the backstory of these two particular I guess they end up being villains. Um and how you know these average people end up doing bad things because they have to out of necessity. So
Yeah,
and then, right when that scene ends, we bring back all the sound, and we're right into a little bit of a fight scene, like right
yeah.
after that. So they don't even leave a lot of breathing room, which again is kind of a testament to the directors and producers we work with on the show. Like that was their idea, and they're not afraid to kind of play around with things and do things maybe a little bit more unconventionally. Because I probably wouldn't have done that. I designed sound for that entire scene thinking we were going to play it that way. And, that's just kind of part of the creative process is you sort of
That's
land
what I
on.
wasn't sure. When something's music heavy like that, are you working on adjusting levels of that, or is it just playing straight? How do you do that as far as from with your job, with your, is it, do you do anything or they just let it ride with the music unaffected?
So in that situation, we literally just took all of our effects that we cut and just muted them all and let music play. So
That's it.
that's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
But in a typical scene, that's like music forward, but mixing
Pulling it
between
down.
you are mixing between tons of different elements and finding a balance between things. Um, you know, there is kind of a standard and a process that you go through on any show or movie that you're working on where dialogue is always king. Even
Yeah.
in the biggest, loudest scenes, you need to hear what the characters are saying. And a great example is the season three finale that you mentioned. You know, Conquest is just pummeling Invincible, and you can still hear them talking to each other.
But
Um,
but I have to
and
turn off dialogue mode. I'm sorry. I'll go with subtitles because I want to feel the room shake. And when I go into dialogue mode, I'm not hit with it in the same way. And I'm
yeah,
okay if I miss a word or two here and there. That's fine. To me, I feel like if I'm watching a scene like that and I miss, that's kind of how it would happen in a reality anyway. I
yeah,
wouldn't pick
yeah.
up every word if there were
No.
literal gods fighting in the room. So
Well, there's important narrative points
yes,
that we need
true.
to pick up on, and even in a fight scene like that, you have like efforts. Stephen Yeun, who plays Invincible,
Hmm.
he's when he's getting hit,
Yeah,
and you
true.
want to hear all those kinds of things too. Um, but yeah, dialogue is always king, no matter what you're working on. I would say music usually comes in at a close second. When we mix, we usually do dialogue first, and then we mix everything else around the dialogue. Music usually comes second. And then we will start to mix in our effects, backgrounds, Foley, that kind of stuff. And that way, since we've done the dialogue and music first, we can kind of, up the effects in moments where they're not really talking and they're just beating the crap out of each other. And then we can dip things accordingly. If there's a line that we need to clear or an emotional beat that we need to play up in the music. And then, if there's a quieter scene, we can feature some of the effects more than we usually would. Maybe the L train passing by off screen, or they live in a fictional Chicago, so they're on the lake. Maybe we're hearing the water a little more on the establishing shot. So it's really situational, but there are some sort of standard practices that every good sound person follows.
Sure.
Um, and yeah, that a lot of the decision making comes from the specific specs that we have to meet as sound professionals. But sometimes it's purely creative, and maybe we are pushing a bone break over a line of dialogue for a reaction from the audience. So
Yeah.
it really depends. But we will kind of make a lot of those decisions on our own as sound people, and then when we show them to the directors or producers or whoever we're working with, we're kind of doing fine tweaks from there. So yeah.
Well, there's even sometimes it'll be used to heighten where there's an injury and the sound will drop out and you'll just have the high pitch, almost like the tinnitus is kicking in for a second.
Yeah.
And it's just, then the dialogue starts to come in. So there's been a conversation happening that Mark couldn't hear. And you're just getting insight to to what he's experiencing for a moment through that injury. And it's just those little things that they're subtle, but man, they really do carry weight and they work really well when you use them.
Yeah, and the audience only hears what we
What you
what we
choose.
get what we give them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to cover up a line with all the blood and bones breaking or whatever, it could easily be the other way around. But that's kind of where you land on creatively through the process.
I'm a big fan. Enjoy the show. I'm glad you're working on something that people are just. It's very very strange that I can talk to my son and his friends about the show, and I can talk to coworkers about the show. And it's just one of those things that if you're not, if you're okay with something that goes pretty gnarly with this violence, you actually have a pretty fun story here that's worth getting through all the gore to enjoy. Because it's definitely over the top, but I think it's a really well made, thoughtful show that actually carries a pretty, for lack of a, not to, no pun intended, but it does carry a punch. And I think that that's why it's resonating with people. So congrats on the work, man. You got a hell of a show.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the kind words.
Dude, it was great to meet you, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
You as well. Thanks for having me, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Good luck.
Yeah. Take care. Have a good one.
Thank you. Appreciate it, man.
We used the bridges that we wired and blown. That time's over now. So over now. I can't say I'm sad to see it go. That's over now. So over now. So what you doing in a couple of years? On a Saturday, round Halloween, I'll take your hand and I'll spit up fake blood. Should have known. So now here we go. It looks like the winter's never gonna be cold. It looks like the winter's never gonna be cold. I don't remember the cold time so well. We got so drunk that night, I watched you stomp the life out your phone. I felt special then. It was bad taste or dead alive. And I know you know I meant what I said. Well, looks like the winter's never gonna be cold. It looks like the winter's never gonna be cold. I don't remember the cold time so well. And most people never get what you've always been, always been, always been. And most people never get